Hello everyone! Today we are going to be painting the There and Back Again art kit. So I just have everything laid out here and we'll just get right into it. So with my setup, I have a piece of paper, and this just protects my table for when we do any of our base coating around the edges. I have a cup of water. And then I have, this is just an old plastic lid, so like from a margarine container or an ice cream bucket. Really anything to mix paint on. If you don't have an old lid, it's just as easy to use a piece of tin foil. You can use a piece of cardboard, just anything where we can get our colors all mixed. And then one other thing I like to have is just a pencil. So once you get yourself all set up, I'm just going to open up my paints here. And oh, perfect. So I'm going to take all my little extras off of the piece and just set them to the side for now. We will base coat them last. So we're going to start with our very back layer. So with the pencil, what I like to do before I start is just run along the inside of this frame. And then this just gives you a nice idea. And you don't have to go too crazy around the tree, but just to get an idea. So when we take this layer off, that this part here is what's going to be exposed, where the rest of it's actually going to be covered by wood. So we don't have to focus too much about making sure that everything there is painted. So it just saves a little bit of time and a little bit of paint. So for our background, feel free to get creative, and if you want to do any sort of a fun color of sky or pattern, I'm just going to do just a basic sky. So I'm going to grab some of my blue. Oh, and then the last thing you need is just a paper towel. So I like to just set mine below my palette, so when I wash my brush, I just have something to dry my brush on. So I have my blue pulled out, and I'm going to pull out a little bit of green. And then I'm also going to grab a little bit of black, and I'm just going to put it, I like to keep all my colors separate on my palette until I'm actually ready to mix, and this way you can really control how much of each color you're mixing. And then I'm just going to put some white right there. So to start, I'm actually just going to take this green and the blue. So I'm just going to take just a little bit of green and start mixing it in with the blue. Oh, I'm going to need a little bit more blue. Here we go. So whenever I mix a blue, I always like to put just a little bit of green, and it just adds a little bit of depth to the color and makes it more of an interesting tone than just straight blue. I'm just going to add all that green in. Perfect. That is a pretty good starting point for the color. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to grab just a little bit of black. So I put just the very corner of my brush in that black. And whenever you're mixing black, you want to start quite slowly, just because it's a very potent color. So it can darken things up a lot quicker than you expect. So always start with the smallest amount of black. Awesome. So once you get a nice dark blue, I'm just going to follow along and adding a little bit of water as I go, just to make the paint nice and fluid. So I'm just following along that pencil line of the frame, and I am going over it. So I'm going over it just enough that I know all the paint will be underneath and I won't have any gaps when the frame sits on top of this. Just adding little bits of water. And we're just going to get a nice, that's pretty good there. Just a nice covering of the blue. And then I'm going to grab all of this white, and I'm actually just going to mix it right in with that blue that's left over there. If you have quite a bit of blue left over, maybe pull a little bit out and just slowly start mixing it with the white, because we want to be with the same tone of blue, but we want to be quite a shade lighter. So we're just going to take this lighter blue and just gonna follow along and go right up to the edge of that darker blue we just did. And I am gonna just, where the tree is, just because some of the branches have holes, so I am just gonna fill this in with a little bit of a layer, just in case if anything is poking through, we don't have a big gap. Perfect. So once your lighter blue is meeting up with your darker blue, you're going to want to wash all the paint off your brush. And this is quite wet, so this is actually like dripping with water, and that is actually perfect for what we're going to do here. So with your wet brush, you're going to start in this darker paint area and just start moving your brush back and forth and bring it into the lighter color below. So with the water on your brush, it's actually just going to start blending these two colors together. And dip it as you go, and just keep working the paints back and forth. And your darker color will be pretty dry by now, but your lighter color will still be pretty wet. And that's actually what gives us a really nice ombre and a really interesting base for our sky. So just keep getting your brush, keep working it back and forth. Adding water as you need it. And feel free to go up and down to kind of get the two paints starting to merge together. But I always like to finish going side to side, just because then it has a more natural way that the sun, like the sky actually goes. So keeping it horizontal just makes it look really natural. I'll just work this all back and forth. Perfect. And then once you have that all worked in, I'm actually just gonna make sure your brush is nice and clean, especially when going into your white, just because you don't want to contaminate all of that. And then I do want this to be mainly white. I'm just mixing it in with just a hint of the blue, just so it's almost an off-white. But we want a very light blue, and this is actually going to be our last color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow along this whole bottom here, and then any little points that are still showing here. And I'm going to bring my white just a little bit up into here, and that's just because with the tree sitting on top, I really want the tree to stand out. So putting just a little bit of white below is going to help make that pop. So, and then once you have all your white paint down, you can wash your brush off, and we do want it to be quite wet, like just like before, and start working that white paint into your blue paint. And the key is, yeah, lots of water to really get that looking natural. Just keep kind of working. And wash off your paint if you end up getting a little too much, a little too light. You can just wash the paint off, and then vertically you can go up and down just until you get the two blended, and then finish off by going side to side. just so when it dries, that's the last brush strokes you'll see. Just keep working it until you get just a nice natural looking sky. Perfect. So we have that really nice light to kind of medium and then dark along the edge, and that's exactly what we're looking for when we're working on our sky. So I'm actually just going to grab my my second layer here and just put it on top, just so I can kind of see how everything is looking. And that is looking perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for there. One thing I might actually do is I'm just going to grab just a little bit more white, and I'm actually just going to run it along here. And I just really want to have that white just coming over the top of the hill here. So I'm just going to do just a little touch up and just really accentuate that white there. And just getting a really good blend. So I just liked, yeah, that little bit of extra, just like the sun's coming up. Perfect. So once you're happy with your background, we can set this one aside to dry. So I'm just gonna shimmy that one off. And then we're gonna base coat our second layer here. We're gonna need lots of green. So I'm just gonna go ahead and pull out a pretty good dollop of our green here. And yeah, let's just get right into it with our green. So just gonna go along the top, and then this is where you're really gonna want a piece of paper in behind, just because this can get a little messy. So we're just gonna get a nice green base coat on the top of our tree. And I am just gonna leave all my little branches coming through here. Perfect, yeah. There we are. So yeah, if you leave your branches, we will get those and we will paint them all brown. So I'm just gonna pull out this brown here. And this is quite a dark tone of brown. So I'm just gonna take just a touch of white and I'm just gonna lighten it up just a little bit. So just kind of start with a little bit of white and mix until you get just a nice medium brown tone. That's looking pretty good. Perfect. And then next I'm actually going to get into painting the detail, and then we can go crazy and get everything covered in green. But it's kind of nice to do all this little detail without this being painted, just because you're going to get your wrist. You could get your wrist in it and then you'll get paint everywhere. So I'm going to start by mixing for these little two windows here. And it's actually a light blue that I'm going to use. And feel free to do your windows and your door any color you'd like. This is really fun because you can customize it and do any sort of little house you'd like to do. So I just added a little bit of white and blue until I get just a nice medium blue. And just following along the engraved lines. And they do make a really nice little gutter for your paint. But don't worry if you end up going over, because we're just going to base coat this next, so you'll just cover it up. So, and I did switch to my my finer brush here, just to make a little bit of the smaller stuff easier. Perfect. And then for the door, I'm actually going to take some blue, and I'm going to grab a little bit of this green. Actually, a little bit more of that green. And I'm going to mix this all together. And that's looking pretty good. So I want a really deep kind of foresty green. So that's looking pretty good. So by adding a little bit of blue to that, it just gives it a really interesting tone. So with this one here, I just went right over the door handle because that's easy to touch up later. And I'm just going to follow along. And I like dipping my brush in water as I go. It just really helps make the paint glide on here nice and easy. Perfect. And then next I'm going to paint actually the whole facade of the house. So I'm just actually going to use my my color straight from the paint pot here. I do really like this mustardy yellow. And the key is just to take your time. Follow along. Perfect. And this little bit of the house right here. Awesome. And then for all of my little beams, I'm actually just going to use this little bit of a lighter brown that we mixed for the tree. And I don't know if you can tell, but I have my brown a little bit more water is what I've added to my brown. And that is so you'll actually see some of the wood grain through, which just seems really appropriate for these beams. Seems a shame to cover up all this natural wood. So if you do it a little bit watery, you're going to get some of that coloring through. Don't worry too much about staying too close to the lines on the top part here, just because we're going to come over with our green after this. So. Perfect. And then I just have my little ring around the door, and I'm also just going to do that in this brown. Perfect. And once you got the front of your house all base coated, and just double check, yeah, we look pretty good everywhere. I'm just going to take just a tiny bit of yellow, and I'm just actually going to paint this little door handle in, just because my door is dry, so perfect. Next, I'm actually going to just base coat these stairs, because then when we go with the green, that'll kind of be our last color for the base of this. So for the stairs, I'm going to do this just a nice light gray. So I just have some white here, and then I still have a little bit of black on my palette. So once again, start with just a very small amount of black and mix that in with your white, because yeah, it'll get darker much quicker than you think. And actually, yeah, that's very much what I'm looking for. So with the steps, I'm actually not gonna spend too much time being careful. Instead, I'll be careful when I come in with my green. So I'm just gonna you're gonna want to be careful just once you get to the top of this step, just to carefully go right up to the line. And then I am going to be careful just along the bottom here, and that's because with my frame color, I'm actually going to mimic the brown we did, where you see a little bit of the wood grain through. So I'm just going to be careful to not get any paint over. There we go. And that's looking pretty good. And then before I paint my green, I am actually going to paint my frame. So with my brown, I'm quite low on it here, so I'm just going to get in here and grab a bit more brown. And I'm going to get my brown really watery. So you want it to look almost like a stain. like if you were just staining a wood, like your deck or your fence. But yeah, get a really nice watery brown, and you can kind of just test it out. So I am really going for that natural look. So if you have a little too much paint, add more water. Too much water, just add a little bit more paint. And I'm just gonna really give this almost like a wash with the brown. And then you'll get some of that nice wood grain coming through. And I'm just gonna go all the way along. And I'm not going to be too careful here as well. Instead, I will take my time once I get to my green. So I'm just going to really lay this on. I'm grabbing water as I need to. And just really work it into the wood. And then give your brush a good wash, and then we are ready for our main coat here. So I am just using the green straight out of the little paint pot here. And that's because this is a really nice base to start with. So we'll mix the lighter green once we get into our details, but this is just a nice rich green. So take your time when you get to your lines here. And I like to move my brush back and forth, so I don't know if you can see that here. So if I'm trying to get a straight line, the key is to have a little bit of water mixed in with your paint. And then you actually use your brush and go side to side, kind of back and forth like this. And you can work the paint into quite a nice straight line. So that's actually a method I use quite often. So I'm just using my brush and I'm going side to side and just getting a straight line on the other side of this beam here. And I'm going to kind of do that all the way along. The other option is to switch to your little detail brush, and you can also get a really good fine point with that. But and I'm using the same method up against my frame here. It's just using the side of the brush and just swiping back and forth. And I am going to get my detail brush when it comes to those little blades of grass. So just paint the larger areas and where you're comfortable with the big one, and then we can switch to our little one when doing any of those fine details where we really want to take the time. And then once you're done all your large areas, just gonna clean this brush off and set it aside and go with my little detail brush here. And then just taking my time and getting in all these little grass blades. Awesome. And then once you're done base coating your second layer here, just gonna get my brushes all nice and washed. Oh, I just noticed my my brown went a little bit over my step here. So I'm actually just gonna take just a little bit of white and a little bit of black. And I'm just gonna touch this up. So any other little touch-ups that you see on your second layer. So when we come back to this layer, we'll actually be working on all the highlights and the shading. So if anything looks like it might need a little bit of a second coat or a little touch-up, now is a good time to do it. So there we go. And just because it's a little bit different than the first one I mixed, I'm actually just going to go ahead and kind of be consistent with that tone I just added in up the steps. And I'm just doing it on just the tops of the steps, but I'm only doing this just because I did a little touch up in my paints, just a little bit of a different tone than I originally had. So there we go. So just to kind of keep it consistent all the way up the steps there. Awesome. So next we'll just grab all of our little extras here. And I'm just gonna kind of organize them according to what color I'm gonna do. So kind of my bottom row here, I'm gonna do browns. I'm gonna put those two banners up there. So just all my pots kind of below. I'm gonna do green on my bushes here. Perfect. So I'm gonna start with our brown here. I'm just gonna pull out just a touch of white, just to lighten this up just a little bit. And I'm gonna use the same method I was using where I'm going a little bit more waterier, just so I can see that natural wood grain come through. So just gonna start by have fun and feel free to paint these any color that you would like. I'm actually just gonna do just the stem of the little mailbox. So just go along and we're just gonna base coat each one of these. So have fun with what colors you want to use. And yeah, take your time with all the little details. Awesome. And I might actually just grab just a little bit of this yellow and mix just a touch of my brown here. And I'm just gonna add just this little bit of a different tone, just so they're not all exactly the same. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Perfect. I'm just gonna grab just a little bit of white, and I'm just lightening up this yellowy brown, and I'm just gonna do the top of my mailbox in this lighter tone. And I'm just going to use the pure yellow for the whole flag. Just keep it nice and neutral. Awesome. So next I'm going to do all of the green. So I'm going to grab just a nice amount of green, and then we're really going to want all of these to stand out against our background. So with our green, I'm just going to pull out some white, and then I'm also going to pull out our yellow here. And then I'm going to slowly just start with just a little bit of color and a little bit of white, and just mix this into a lighter green, and then the yellow just gives the green a little bit of depth. So that's looking pretty good, but I still want it to be just a touch lighter. So I'm just gonna grab a bit more white. Yes, yeah, that's very much what I'm looking for. So once you get a tone you're happy with, and you can do different tones of green, feel free to mix a couple, and you can just keep kind of adding different tones of yellow and white, and you can get some pretty fun tones of green. And I'm just painting right over the little engraved lines with the flowers, just because those are going to be quite easy to add in, and we can have fun with some color and add all those in later. And same with all of my little bushes and all the little details. I'm just going to paint this straight over green just to keep our base coat nice and easy. And then for this last little bush, I'm just going to add just a bit more white. And just make it just even a little lighter than the other ones. Just do any little touch-ups that you see you might need. It is a nice thick acrylic, so usually you don't need a second coat on anything, but if there's anywhere you went a little light or maybe added a little bit of water, it might just need a little bit of a touch-up here and there. Perfect. So while I wait for these to dry, I'm just going to work on my two little signs here. So I'm just going to kind of shimmy everything up. And so for these two here, I'm actually going to mix a color that is very similar to the actual wood that is shown, but I just want to kind of clean up the little bit of burning from the engraver. So I'm just going to grab just some white, and then we actually need tiny bits of this brown and tiny bits of this yellow, but it's a very, very small amount for what I want, because I want it to be this very natural wood tone. So here you're just really going to want to start off with like barely any paint. So I'm just wiping it off my brush, and I'm going to dip my brush just a little bit in here and wipe that off my brush. And I'm just going to actually start with what's left on the brush, because it's a very small amount. So I'm just going to kind of smush my brush in here and just get the little bits that I had on my brush off and see, and you can kind of test on the corner. That's a little light, so we can go in and grab just a tiny bit of the yellow and a tiny bit of the brown and go just a little bit of a shade darker. I'm just going to check that out. Still a little light, so, but it is a good idea just to do this slowly because it can get quite dark quite quick, so. I think that's very much what I'm looking for here. Yeah. So once you get a color that you like, and once again, you could do this any color you'd like, I'm just gonna keep it just quite natural here. So I'm just gonna run my brush along. And one of the key to keeping the engraved lines nice and thick is using the very side, the very flat of your brush, and just kind of carefully doing little strokes, and then you won't get too much paint in the actual engraved lines if you like the look of the engraved lines, but we're just going to go along and it just kind of cleans up these burn marks. And I'm actually going to paint the inside of the lettering here as well, but there we go. It just kind of cleans that up a little, and then I'm going to do the same thing with the sign here. And having your brush a little bit drier is another good trick to not getting too much paint into the little engraved lines, because I am actually not gonna do anything else on this little sign just because the lettering is so small. So I just really want to kind of clean up so you can really see the lettering on this sign. So yeah, very dry brush for this. It's kind of key, and then that looks really good. Perfect. So then with this one here, I'm just going to give this brush a good wash and set it aside. I'm going to grab my little brush, and I'm just going to use our dark brown here. So I add just a nice amount of water, and I'm giving the brush almost like a roll. So I roll it, and then you get a really nice fine point on your brush. And then I'm just gonna take my time and paint the inside of the lettering, and going back for paint quite often, and just giving it another little roll in the watery paint. Perfect, yeah. So our base coat is looking pretty good. So I'm actually just gonna rearrange these. Now that we've finished this, all our green is dry. So I'm just gonna pull down what kind of needs a little bit of shade and highlight. So the bench looks pretty good and our signs all look pretty good. So first I'm gonna do any of my little flower colors. So I'm gonna go in and I'm actually just gonna pull out this really nice bright lemon yellow. And these little flowers here, I'm just gonna, and I'm gonna keep the paint quite thick, and that's just so you get really good coverage over that green. Awesome. And then I'm gonna use just my pure red on these tiny little ones here. And same thing, I like to keep the paint quite nice and thick. And I'm actually almost balling the thick paint just on the edge of my brush. And that's kind of, and just dabbing it into the flowers there. Thus you just get a nice amount of coverage, and then the thick paint has just a really nice texture when it's quite globby like that. So there we go. Oh. I know these little ones are a little bit more meticulous to paint, but and then I'm going to grab some of this red. And then I'm going to grab some of my white here. And I'm going to look in just for a nice medium pink. And that looks pretty good. And just going to paint all these flowers pink. So this is a little bit watery. I like it to be just a little bit thicker, so I'm just going to grab a bit more white. And this is just to kind of thicken up the paint. It got a little watery while I was washing my brush there, so. Perfect. And then I'm actually going to mix just a light blue for all these little ones in here. And if you wanted to do this, the other thing you could do is just a light green to make it look almost like a thistly bush, but I like the idea of making that one look more like flowers. So I'm just going to grab, that's actually a nice one to start with, and then just kind of using the edge of my brush and just dabbing. You don't have to worry too much about staying in the lines. Those are really just like a nice little guide for you, but they're not hard, fast rules you have to follow or anything. So you can just kind of have fun and add whatever colors or little embellishments you'd like on these. Yeah, don't worry too much if you go over. We're going to be adding shading and highlighting, so these are going to look good. Perfect. So I'm actually, now that I just finished this, I'm going to grab blue straight from my little blue pot. And I'm just going to add just dots. So I'm just like this, almost adding polka dots to the blue. So where I just painted, I'm just going to kind of add little dots here and there, and it's just the pure blue right from the pot, and it's just going to add just a little bit of a darker tone, make it a little bit more interesting. And I'm going to also add just kind of a few along my edges and kind of here and there, and it's just going to make this look a little bit more like flowers. Yeah, I'm not going to really stick to my lines, just kind of add in anywhere that looks like it could use a little dab of blue. And then that just gives, yeah, the bush a little bit more depth there. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to pull out just my red. I'm going to mix it with just a little bit of this pink, but I do want it to be quite dark. And just like we did with this one, we're just going to go in. We're just going to add just a little bit of depth to these. So I'm going along the bottom of the flower line and just kind of dabbing my brush in there. And just adding a little bit of depth to these flowers. Perfect. And then while I have this color, this is actually a lighter version of this red, so I'm going to go in and I'm just going to add a little bit, just a dot to each one of these little red flowers, and just adding that depth. And then I'm going to go into my dark yellow here and adding a little bit of the darkness just on the lower side of these. Perfect. So it's really just using multiple tones of the same color is how we get that depth. So all the shading and highlighting essentially is just using a lighter and a darker version of that color. So those are all looking pretty good. So I think what I'm going to do is just kind of finish these ones off, and then we'll be ready to pull out our second layer there. So even for our back layer, we're going to need a lighter green. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull out the last bit of my green in the container there. And then I'm going to pull out some white and just kind of slowly bring that white in. I'm not mixing all of the color just yet because right now I want a lighter tone than this. So I actually want quite a light green. So that's very much what I'm looking for. So almost like a pastel-y, minty kind of green. And I'm going to do, so with this brush here, I kind of want it a little bit dry. So I'm just kind of dabbing the paint off of my brush. So find a nice clean area. You can also use your paper towel. And we want it to be just kind of dry. So on my piece of paper here, if you can see, as I dab it, there's not a lot of paint on it. Just little bits, and we really just kind of want this texture. So I'm going to go and I'm just going to use the side of my brush, and I'm just going to dab a little bit of texture onto my bushes. We don't want to do anything too crazy, but just a little bit of highlight. And if it's a little too light for you, you can just grab a little bit of green. I can just show you here. Just add a little bit more green There we go. So it's not as harsh of a color, but just play around and just bounce your brush, and we're just looking for add a nice texture to all of our greenery here. This one here, I'm actually not going to bounce. I'm going to use the flat of the brush and just add some straight, just a couple little straight lines in there, just because this one looks more like one of those kind of pokey bushes versus a bushy bush. All my technical terms here. So with this one here, you want to be careful not to touch any of the flowers, but I'm just bouncing my brush just in between, and you just need very little because the flowers really do add a lot of depth to this one. So just kind of bouncing in between and just adding a little bit of texture. Same with this one, you can kind of go in and just add just kind of here and there. And really have fun with this. I love doing all the little texture on all these little bushes. I find it very relaxing to paint grass and bushes. Same with these ones here. You're just gonna kind of wanna just get in there just a little bit, not going over too much of your color, but adding that nice depth in there. And I'm gonna wait and do this one with my small brush just because that one's quite small. And actually, yeah, we're looking pretty good. So if you ended up going with a medium tone, you can always go over with a little bit of a lighter tone. And that's how you really get depth, is just adding a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter all the way through. And that's what really makes things look realistic, is layering all these colors and getting lighter and lighter and lighter as you get closer to the top. So it's looking pretty good. So I'm going to switch to my little brush here, and I'm going to just go in on this one here and just add a couple little pokey lines just to give that one a little bit of something interesting. And then this one here, I'm just going to go along and kind of just accentuate all of these little like leaf-like forms and just kind of adding a couple little lines in here as well. That's looking good. And then with this really liney one, I'm going to go and grab my pure green. I'm just going to add the odd dark line in. So the last bit of detail we'll do on this layer is just going to be just to highlight all of the little browns we have here. So I'm going to grab a little bit of white, and I'm going to slowly mix it in with my brown. That's looking pretty good. And I'm just going to run a little bit of the lighter brown just along the tops, and then just along the bottom of the pots. And I just do a little bit of a swooping line just like that. And then with this one here, just along the bottom is all we need. And this just adds just a little bit of depth to these. And if it's not quite light enough, I'm just gonna add actually a little bit more white. It's looking better. So yeah, we want it to be a tone lighter. Just gonna grab actually a little bit, just a little lighter than that's what I'm looking for. So grab a little bit of white. There we go. There we go. That's actually a little better. And then just along the bottom. And I'm going to go just along the top of the pot. And then just this little bit of a of a highlight to the left. I know these are really small, so it helps to hold it down as you do it. And then with the little birdhouse here, I'm actually just going to use this lighter color, and I'm just going to paint the roof and just the little hole there, just to add a little bit of something. And then I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to run just along the bottom and along the side of the post here. And just along the side of the post here, just because I used this lighter brown here. And then I'm going to want to use actually just pure white. And I'm just going to run a little bit of a highlight along the side and the top. That's looking pretty good. Oh, and maybe a little, just kind of a little here and there. And if your white lines look a little too harsh, wash all the paint off of your brush, and you can just use the side of the brush, and you can just blend that line out. And then just kind of go back through and do any little touch-ups. If your paint was watery, it will dry a little bit, quite a bit lighter than what you painted. So just kind of go and do a little bit of a touch-up. But if it's a little too light for you, like this one, it's a little too drastic. So I'm just going to take a little bit of my brown, and I'm just going to blend it in and just make it look just a little less noticeable. So just really play around with your different tones. And this is me just being a perfectionist. So if you're happy with your pots, you can keep them as is. And as I have my my light brown, I'm actually just going to add just a touch of highlight to this bench. So I'm just going to go just along this front. Oh, I need to go a little lighter. Just along this front. And then the front legs, because the back legs would actually be in shadow. And then I'm just going to add just a little bit to just the top and the bottom. There we go. Just to make that a little bit more interesting. Awesome. So that is actually all the detail, and we're finished this layer here. So I'm gonna just move all of these aside. And I'm gonna bring back my first two layers here. And we're gonna layer everything up and kind of see what we gotta do here. So make sure your top and bottom layer are all lined up. So I'm gonna do a little bit of detail on here, and then I'm gonna layer all my little extras on and do a final highlight. So we're gonna start with our big brush here, and then all of this light green paint that we did. So I'm gonna actually, just to be safe, I'm gonna take my back layer and I'm just gonna set that aside, just because this could get a little messy. So if you still have light green here, if not, pull out your green and your white onto your palette. And we're just gonna start by mixing the two together until we get a nice medium green. And you can always come over here and just give it a little bit of a test. So that's very much what we're looking for. So now that we're done most of our base coating, we are really gonna mess this brush up. So this brush will be nice because you'll have this for the future for any grass or bushes. But what we're gonna do is we're really gonna frazzle all of these ends. And that's how we get really good texture for grass and bushes, is the more frazzled this end is and the wider it is, the more bushier and the more grassier things are gonna look. So in order to ruin our brush here, I'm actually just gonna really push my brush into the palette. So I'm just really trying to get this to look nice and frazzled. And as you can see, when I test on my paper, when I bounce the edges of the bristles, we just get a really fun texture. So we're just really gonna take this brush and and we're gonna ruin it a little bit. But once you get a nice amount of paint and you get a nice broad stipple to your bristles here, we're just gonna bounce them onto this piece with this lighter color. Really get that texture all the way through. And if this is looking a little light, stippling's really fun because we can go in, and this is actually just the pure green from the pot, and you can just kind of stipple back and forth between the lighter and the darker colors and get a really nice texture on your tree here. And just keep going until you're happy. Adding light, adding dark. Just really making this nice and textured. And so to get it really kind of muted, I really push the bristles in, and then you get kind of like a deep stipple, where if you go very, very light, you get a more textured detail, like you get all these tiny little things that look like leaves, where if you really push it in, you get more of a broad look. So it really is just personal preference. I like to mix up between the two and then just kind of go back and forth and really play around until you're happy with the texture on your tree, and that's looking pretty good. I like to do really pushed in ones at the start, and then as I get near the end, I like to just dab very lightly. So once you're happy with your green, the final thing I like to do, and I'm just going to use my little brush just because I like how this one's looking right now, I'm going to pull just a nice amount of white. Just a nice amount of white out onto my palette. And the final highlight that I like to do, so I take just a little bit of the pure white and just kind of work it in so you don't have too much paint. But so I have just the pure white, and I just go along the very tops and the bottom. And this one I go with just a little bit more definition and just a little bit more purpose. And it's really just going to add that final little detail. So going kind of along the bottom of the branches. And anything that looks like it's a separate little section of tree, adding that just along the bottom. And just kind of here and there, and that just gives it just a really nice finished look. So, and you can play around with this for hours. So feel free to pause me and really play around and have fun with your texture there. Awesome. So we're actually the same thing that we just did here. We're gonna do that down here. So before I bring my detail in, I'm just going to want to do this with just the medium green. We won't do any of this final white texture until we have all our little pieces, just because we're only going to want to highlight what's going to be shown. So mix more of your light green if you don't have any. And just test it out on here. And that's a little too light. I want it to be lighter than the base coat below, but I don't want this to be really drastic like the tree. I want this to be a little bit more subtle, so just keep bringing in green until you get, there we go, that's actually quite nice. So if you can see what I mean by I don't want it to be very, very light, but I just want to add this texture in. And I'm just going to bounce around this whole hill and just be careful around the house here. But just kind of have fun and go go slow when you get close to any of your edges there. And we'll do a final highlight there, so don't worry too much about it being completely even along there. And just really bounce your brush, and as you can see, the more and more we bounce, the better texture we're getting here. Something that's looking pretty good. So I'm gonna wash this brush off. And even after washing it and cleaning it and drying it, you will kind of always have that little bit of texture after using the brush for this, so it'll be good. You'll have a nice brush for doing trees. Once you're happy with your grass and all of your green spots, we're going to go and we're going to do our detail on the front of the house and then the stairs. So with the house here, I'm actually going to start with our dark brown here. I actually have a little bit on my palette here, so I'm just going to get some water and get this kind of ready to go. So you're going to want to make this quite watery. So I can just show you on the palette, on the paper here. So I'm adding enough water that I get a really translucent brown. So once you get a nice watery consistency, I'm just going to go into the house here. And with the side of my brush, I'm just running it along. And we're just adding some depth in to the yellow. So just keep kind of dipping as you need it. And I'm just going to go along all the edges. And just adding a little bit of this. Just adds a little bit of texture and some depth. It's looking pretty good. And then while you have your watery brown, just touch up any little bits of your little arches here, if you need to. And then I'm gonna take a good amount of my black and just put it on my palette here. And I'm adding a little bit of water to this. Not too much, not like what we were doing here with with the shading, but what I want is I want the black to be just really fluid. So I want to be able to do some really nice fine lines like this. So you can just test. So just adding a little bit of water to the paint just makes it run really nice and fluid. So once you got a nice fluid black, I'm actually doing the little detail on the windows and the doors. So I'm gonna go and I'm just gonna draw just a little square in the middle of the window. And then I'm taking the corners of my square and I'm just connecting it to the circle. I'm going to do the same on this side. Now this is just what I'm doing, so any little fun window details you want to do, this is where you can really have fun and personalize and make this your own. So, and then I'm going to add just a few other little lines straight in the middle and straight across. And that's just to add just a little bit of detail. I'm also then going to follow along the engraved line all the way around just to really make this stand out. And then I'm gonna, with my door, I'm gonna run along vertical lines. I debated adding these lines in with the engraver, but I decided against it just because I wanted you to have the option of doing whatever you wanted to do with your little hole here. So I'm doing the very traditional look here, but you can really have fun and add in any little details. And so I'm also just following along the engraved line all around the door. And then I have my lines there. And then I'm going to water down my black just a little bit. And I'm just going to add just a few little lines. Now these are quite a bit waterier, if you can see, than the lines in between. And this is, I just want to add a little bit of texture to make this look a little bit woody. So I'm just going to kind of run that along. Make it look a little woody. So when that dries, it'll just be a little lighter than the other ones. So while we have a watery black, so we're watering this down to the consistency that we did our brown earlier. So water down your black, and then we're going to use this just to shade. So I'm going to run this along this inside line of the beams. I'm going to go along and do that on all the beams here. Run this black watery line down. Perfect. Just adding little bits of depth here and there. I'm also going to do just along the underside of here and adding just a little bit of detail. And then with this watery black, I'm going to want this quite watery. I'm going to go along and I'm going to do just the front of the steps. So I don't want this to be crazy dark. So if you can see how watery it is here, and I'm just going to want to run. And it's really just going to show that this is the front of the step and that this is the top of the step. So once you get a nice watery black, just going to follow along the steps and go all the way down. And really shade the top bits. Awesome, looks pretty good there. And just kind of have a look and see anywhere else where you'd like a little bit of shade, but that is it's looking pretty good. Just gonna add a little bit of this black shade line just to the side of my tree here. And just kind of a little bit on the branches, there we go. And then the last thing we're going to want to do is add just little bits of highlight. So what we just did with our black, so I'm going to go in and just get some just pure white. And if you have any room on your palette, mine's getting a little full. We're going to want just a nice watery white to do a little final highlight here. So I'm just going to kind of test it on here. So as you can see how watery it is. So when I put this down, it looks quite white, but with my finger it's so watery that I can just kind of tap it with my finger and it goes away. So that's very much what we're looking for. And this is just to add a little bit of highlight. So it goes on quite dark if you have the right amount of water. But when that water dries, it's going to be quite subtle. So I'm just going to go along with my watery white. And if it's a little too much water, just kind of use your finger. And the finger's nice just to give it a little bit of a natural blend. So I'm just going to go along and add little bits of this highlight to the top of my door. I'm going to go along and add a little bit to the inside. Also onto the one side of my beam. This is just a nice contrast to that dark we added, and that's what's going to give all this nice depth. And as you can see, it's drying and it's very light and subtle. So if yours is quite white, you're just going to want to add a little bit more water. And using your finger as you need to. And then I'm also going to go in my little windows and just kind of follow along with my black lines, adding a little bit of white just to contrast that. That's looking pretty good. I'm actually just going to run this little bit of lightness all along the inside ring of the door. It's looking good. And then with our pure white, we're going to want to do the same thing just along the steps here to really make them pop. I'm going to layer everything up. So I'm going to pull out in my back and layer on my front here. So before we bring in all our little extras, I'm actually going to glue these 2 layers down. And this is just going to make it easier because then once you get the positioning of all your little extras, you won't have to move them in order to glue this down. So this is your little pot of wood glue here. So I'm just going to open this up. And I'm just going to shimmy my paints out of the way for now. And then I'm going to take the second layer and I'm going to flip it over here. And with the little popsicle stick, you can scoop out some wood glue. You actually don't need a ton of this wood glue. It's a really good quality. It's got really good, like it'll set really fast. So you don't need a ton of it. You don't want it seeping out from this layer onto your next layer. So we're just going to get a nice amount to spread around. And we're going to go quite thin. And I'm just making sure I kind of have all of my edges, just so there's lots of points of contact. I'm not going to put any on these tiny little branches just because you're going to end up getting glue all over your background, which is what we don't want. So I'm just going to make sure I got some up in the in just the large tree areas here and there. And then the other thing we're going to want to do is we're just going to want to follow along the frame. And just with a nice thin layer, just going to follow along. And I don't put any on my little tabs. I just don't want to interfere with the string that we're going to add. So I just kind of steer clear of the tabs. As long as you have the frame underneath it, that will be more than enough. So I'm just going to set that there. And then I'm going to flip this over. And then I'm just going to carefully line up the 2 layers before I drop it down, just so we have as little glue everywhere as possible. And you're going to want to make sure that these tabs are completely lined up. Perfect. And then apply pressure down. And don't worry if you get a little bit of glue coming out the edges. It's bound to happen, so we'll just give it a good push. And then any little bits there, if you grab your big brush and just make sure it's really, really clean, you don't want any paint on it, but you want it to be just a little bit damp. And then just run it along any of the little seepages. And this is just gonna spread it out, and because the glue does dry like a yellowy clear, so it'll be just a touch noticeable if it does. And yeah, just make sure any little seepages are taken care of, and then give this a really good wash because that glue will just dry on the bristles. Awesome. Perfect. So once you have the back and second layer all glued together, we can grab all our little extras and start having fun customizing your little hole here. And you can actually go up and do 3 layers. So if you can see here, I have my 2 bushes laid out. And then if you have 2 points of contact below another piece, you can actually put things on a 3rd layer. So yeah, really have fun and take your time laying everything out and figuring out what pieces you want to use. You can use all the pieces, you can use none of the pieces. You could just do the hole in the banner, like, yeah, just go and have fun with this. So here I have some point of contact on the sign and then also on the bottom of the little birdhouse. So I'm gonna just carefully glue those guys together. I like using all my little extras. I love how the fronts of all the houses have all these cutesy little gardens, but you can make it as simplistic as you'd like. Awesome. Well, I think I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm actually going to glue this layer down before I do my final highlight, just because as you try to highlight things, you might make things move. So it is just a nice idea to get everything, once you have it all set out, glued down. So I'm just going to move that one aside, and then just piece by piece add a little bit of wood glue. And get everything set into place. And then if you are doing any of the 3 layers like this, it's nice just to kind of make note. I'm actually going to use my little pencil, and I'm going to add just little lines just very carefully there. And then I'm going to take my glue, just so you don't have a bunch of excess glue where you don't need it. So I'm just going to add just a touch here and a touch here. And then if you do have multiple layers, you just hold them for about 30 seconds just to make sure just to make sure that they set. And you don't move around at all. Perfect. And with tiny little pieces like this, you're just going to want just a little bit just on the largest surface area. You don't have to worry about getting any of the tiny little stems. The glue will be strong enough to hold with just little bits on the backs. And I'm just going to want to make sure that this is in a good position before I let it set. If you're doing any 3-layer things. Looks pretty good there. And then if you have a little bit of glue seepage, your tiny little brush, and once again make sure there's no paint and that it is nice and damp, and you can just clean up that glue. And you're going to want to do it sooner rather than later just because it does start to dry pretty quick. And just anywhere that and then make sure it's nice and clean before you set it aside so it doesn't, that glue doesn't dry on the bristles and ruin the brush. This one's a little bit trickier just because there's just a small amount of surface area, but any little touch-ups with any glue coming out. Looking pretty good, and I think everything's glued down. Just gonna do a little bit of a check. Yeah, nothing's moving around. Perfect. So once I have everything glued down, I'm just gonna do a final little highlight here. So it's nice to see once everything is in place. So I'm gonna go and I'm gonna grab just a little bit of my white, and I'm gonna mix it in with just a little bit of green, and I want quite a light green. So I want it to be lighter than this medium one we used here. So I'm just gonna grab a little bit more white, and that's looking pretty good. And I'm just gonna add, just very carefully, just a little bit of a final highlight. And it's very much the same tone of the lightness in our tree. And I like to just add it just along the top of the hill. And then the reason I glued everything down is I don't want to get too close to anything. And it's just because you really want them to be the focus, where if you did this light in and behind, they wouldn't pop as much, where if you just do this on the really exposed areas, and then just like a little bit. So I like to go along and just anywhere that's exposed, just adding a little bit of lightness. Just giving it that final little bit of depth. And yeah, this brush is the perfect amount of frazzled for all this nice texture. So, and then you can always add a little bit in your tree if it looks like you need a little bit more. You could go ahead and add a little bit of cloud with just pure white in the background if you wanted. Any of your bushes, if they look like they need, this is really just your final audit of your piece. So anywhere that's exposed and it just needs a little bit more lightness, you can just kind of add that in now. And I usually do this over a few days. I like to just really take a step back, look at my piece, and just add little bits here and there. And just really give it a final little once over. And adding just little bits of white highlight wherever you think you need it. And I'm going to make sure that this one is really clean and doesn't have any green on it. I'm going to take just a little bit of white. I'm going to get it quite watery because I do want it to be fairly translucent. You can kind of test it. You can't really test it on your paper just because you won't really see it. But I want this to be very watery and like a very subtle amount of paint. And because we have these really nice bristles now with our brush, you could actually add just a little bit of cloud here and there if you'd like in your background. I do like to do this last, which seems a little funny, but it's just because our brush is in a really nice state after doing all of this stippling that you can get just some really nice little clouds. But this is completely optional. If you're happy with your piece, you can just, so yeah, quite a bit of water, not a lot of paint, and just very subtly, I'm just gonna add just a little bit of texture kind of here and there. And this is nice too because all the layers are glued together so you can really see kind of where things are coming out. And adding this, and I'm really getting my brush in there to get kind of sweeping cloud motions. And anywhere where it looks like you might need just a little texture. You want to start more subtle and add more and more white and paint as you get a bit more confident with it. And I'm just using right now the side of my brush, and I'm just really moving it around, and I'm making nice circles and just really trying to get some nice sweeping clouds in here. Awesome, that's, yeah, just adds a nice texture. This is just to show that your piece doesn't have to be done just because we glued it together and we're done our base coat. You can spend as much time as you'd like going in and adding nice little details and playing around and really having fun with it. Awesome. And just, yeah, a little bit of texture in the background. I like the way that looks. And then our final thing here is actually just our string. So once you're ready to hang this one on the wall, and I would wait 24 hours, you really want this glue to set before you hang it. But I am just gonna put the string in. So you can just feed it through. Feed it through our little hanging tabs here. And then take a look at what length you're gonna want for your string. And I'm thinking, maybe about there, whatever length you'd want. And then I'm just gonna do just a standard knot. But you can really have fun with this. This is a cotton macrame cord. So there's some pretty cool things online and fun knots and ties, but I'm just gonna do just really standard double knot there. And then I'm just gonna find a pair of scissors and I'm gonna trim mine. But this is, once again, completely optional. But I'm gonna trim mine and then I'm gonna pull all these little strings apart and just make a cute little tassel. A cute little tassel with the ends. Awesome. And once this is dry, your piece is ready to hang. Awesome. Oh, look at these cute little hobbit holes. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for painting along with me. I hope you had fun, and we will see you next week.